Let's just give the Lord a hand clap of praise, for he is worthy. He is the healer. He is the restorer. He is the redeemer. And we just love him and bless him tonight. And we praise God for his healing power. We thank you, Lord God, for what you're going to do here tonight. Sister Nikita, so we won't take any of your time. We're going to ask you to come off of mute and go ahead and take us through.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm going to bring my shared screen up. I am so again, good evening. I am excited to be here to talk with you today. I appreciate Elder and Pastor Hardy inviting me to share with you on the topic of relationships. And praying and preparing for this, I was mindful, right, of the fact that I think most of the time when people think of relationships, especially in the church, they think of it in the context of romantic relationships, right? And often marriage in that context. But I also realized that there are a number of us with various relationship status, right, on the call. And so when I was led to talk about is relationships in a more general sense, right? And so my main objective is to try to communicate, right, the importance of getting a few key relationships down that then ultimately will help us when we move into the realm of caring for our romantic relationship. So I think it's important before we start these kind of conversations about things that are very close to our hearts and intimate to talk a little bit about identity. So before jumping in, I want to kind of do what they call socially locate myself, right? So I'm a 30-something, unmarried, marriage and family therapist who is the middle child and only daughter of divorced parents who are still living, thank God. And I grew up in a small, very small rural town. And I've dedicated my life's work to really trying to understand and improve relationships, specifically in the African American community. And so I recognize that all or any of those parts of my identity impact what I chose to share with you, what I choose to focus on. But I also recognize that your identity is in our space as well, right? So some of y'all are mothers, your aunties, your matriarchs, right? Your informal counselors. And there's this wealth of knowledge that you have and already have, right, from your lived experiences. And so I acknowledge that there are different ways of knowing, and that in this space, we can sometimes know from our own lived experiences, and we can know from maybe formal knowledge. And so I invite you to kind of open up to that as well. So I thought I would point out some of my pieces of identity and then give you a little bit of time to reflect on your own. So I am daughter, I am sister, I am partner, I am friend, and I am therapist, and I am self, right? And so in that, I intentionally bring those things to mind because I want for you to do the same. My time is precious. So the fact that I'm taking time to do this activity tells you how important I think it is, right? So I want us to pause just for a minute, you to pull out something to write with, and I want you to take a minute to write down your various roles in relationships and any of the things you may believe are relevant to how you show up in those relationships. So some of the things that I listed was that I was from a small town and that I was the only girl, right? So those aren't necessarily roles that I have in relationships, but they're things that I think impact how I show up in them. And then once you do that, take a few minutes or a few seconds to circle or highlight the 3 that are most salient or present for you right now. So these may be the relationships that are requiring the most of you right now, or ones that you're most grateful for, or even maybe the ones you're most concerned about. But I'll give you a minute to do that. The only people I can really see are Elder and Michelle. So when they stop writing, I'm going to assume that we're ready to go. But if you are still working, then that's for sure. You can take your time and write it out. But I'm going to bring us back together, right? So typically, right, I'm very experiential and I like participation. And I know that I will not finish what I have to do if I do that today. So I want you to hold those things, right? And keep them in the forefront of your mind as we talk about the things that we're going to talk about. And then if there's time at the end, right, I'll process some of that as a group. So I want to start off by talking about really the importance of relationships. And so we talk a lot about kind of like relationships in general, but what does the word, what does God say, right, about relationships? So if we look at some biblical references on relationship, there are like innumerable references to relationship, right? And I think that tells us something about what God thinks about relationship. So here, right, it says, then the Lord God said, it's not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. In Proverbs, he tells us to honor our mother and our father, that our days may be long in the earth, and that the Lord and the life that the Lord has given us. And they also, sorry, that was Exodus. And then we also talk in Proverbs, right, that a friend loves at all times and a brother is born for adversity. In Ecclesiastes, the Bible mentions that two people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Likewise, two people lying close together can keep each other warm. But how can one be warm alone? A person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two can stand back to back and conquer. Three are even better, for a triple braided cord is not easily broken. So to me, what that tells me is that we were created for connection and relationship, that it's God's design that we move through life with others. The word tells us also that the heartfelt counsel of a friend is as a sweet perfume, but it also warns us that the quality of our relationships is important as well, because we also see that the word tells us that whoever walks with the wise will become wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. And so these are things, right, that God has intentionally, right, inspired in his word that gives us a hint that relationship is probably very important to him. And so it even describes the church as a system, right? That we are all different parts that operate and need each other. And so our worlds are no different, right? That we exist in systems, and the relationships that we have are what connect us to those systems. And so now if we kind of step back and say, okay, so we're talking about relationship, but what does it really mean, right? What is the word relationship actually defined as? So it's the way in which two concepts, objects, or people are connected, or the state of being connected. And another definition says that it's the way in which two or more people or groups regard and behave towards each other. So it is that we are connected, and it is how we regard and behave towards each other. So we're going to be talking about relationships in a foundational context today. So I believe that in order to show up our best selves in our relationships with others, there are a few key relationships in which we need to heal, that we need to be comfortable in, and that we need to fully explore. And I believe that those things are our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, and our relationship with our past. I think those of us who are here week by week, we know how good of word and teaching we get about the first, right? So today we're going to focus on the latter two, right? Our relationship with ourself and our relationship with our past. So if we go back to the fact that relationship is that we are connected and how we regard and behave toward each other, what does it really mean then to be in relationship with oneself and in relationship with one's past? It means that we're connected to ourselves, right? That we have an understanding of who we are, and that we are mindful of how we behave toward each other, ourselves, right? if we're honest, right, we often don't have the time to connect and interact and to check in with ourselves because of necessity, because of survival. We lead very busy lives, and so oftentimes it's difficult to say like, what's going on with me? But even if you ask yourself, like, am I able to give the same compassion and grace to myself as I am to other people? A lot of times for most of us, that the answer would be no, right? Not because we don't want to, but because we simply don't have the time. We are all coming out of or still in the middle of, however you want to look at it, right? A global pandemic where people have experienced fear and loss and grief and devastation, but there's no like, hey, let's pause, right? Let's see how we're doing. Let's check in on ourselves. The expectation, right, is that we keep going. I was talking to a friend this past weekend who talked about how students who have spent basically a year and a half not learning anything were expected to just kind of be plugged back into the system, right, wherever they are, and keep moving forward. And I thought, man, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like you have people in second grade who don't know how to read what they need in kindergarten, right? And to myself, I said, like, why would they think that would work, right? Why wouldn't they intentionally address that? But isn't that how we live our lives, right? From day to day, we often don't have time, right, to check in. So being in relationship with ourselves says the same way, right, that we would check in with a loved one, that we would see how we're feeling about things and how we view the world. We need to do that for ourselves. And then being in relationship with our past means being connected to it in an intentional way. And I believe to do that in a healthy way, that means that I can acknowledge, right, that there are things in my past that actively impact how I show up, right, in the world today. So, how are you in the presence of a mom who maybe was harsh all your life, right? So, you're an adult living your own life, raising your own family, and this mom comes to visit, right? What things come up for you in that, right? Or you're maybe moving into a second relationship right after going through a divorce or a breakup. What things in that relationship were potentially my responsibility, right? What things do I need to be accountable for? I think being in relationship and connected to our past is how we behave, right? And that we recognize that we're connected. So, in this, it's kind of clear to see that it's helpful, right, to reflect on our past and on ourselves. There's this theory, right, that in family science that suggests that during infancy and childhood, we develop a general style of attaching to other people, right? And that based on that relationship with our primary caregiver, which is typically our moms, right, we assume kind of sort of ways of being with other people. And these things persist into our adulthood. So kind of sneakily, right, and unbeknownst to us, we are connecting and attaching to people in the same ways we came to connect and attach with those like very first primary relationships. And so I think an important point in this is that, so we don't always fall in love or enter into our chosen relationships with those who care for us in ideal ways, but rather those who care for us in familiar ways, right? So you may think, wow, like I'm seeking out this person because I love him or I love her, right? But we can be completely oblivious to the fact that maybe it's dysfunctional, but it's familiar, so it feels good, right? And so the idea, right, is that we recognize that we have that tendency, right, to connect to people in familiar ways or who feel familiar to us. So I'll briefly kind of go over the idea behind what's called attachment theory, right? So people who develop what's called a secure attachment, right, in childhood are said to have secure attachment. They're typically comfortable with intimacy and autonomy, which means they're kind of doing and being on their own. And you can kind of see that the arrow that's pointing up, right, is kind of like how we think about ourselves, right? And the arrow that's going to the right is how we're thinking about our partners or those that we're in relationship with. And so this is kind of like the positive, right, quadrant of this. So we're comfortable with intimacy and with kind of being on our own. Those who are anxious or preoccupied in attachment tend to be dependent on other people for their self-worth and often are preoccupied with relationships. Let me see, let's look at y'all for a second. How many of y'all have, not saying a few, right? We're not calling them names, but how many of y'all have experienced people like this who seem to be maybe attached this way? Yeah. And so you can kind of see that they struggle, right, with like how they think about relationships, and they maybe are extra needy, right, sometimes in relationships. And then those who have a dismissive or avoidant attachment style tend to be strongly independent and downplay the importance of relationships, right? So these may be the people who are like, it's fine, I got it. I don't need anybody, right? And we just identify that that's simply not true, right? That's not the case. We do need people, but these people struggle, right, with connecting and joining. And then finally, there's a fearful or avoidant attachment style where people are fearful of intimacy and they tend to be socially avoidant. And so a lot of times their relationships with their caregiver wasn't safe, right? And so they may be concerned, right, that getting close will also equal hurt or harm. And so when we look at this, you think, wow, right? So here I am, maybe like, this is all a theory, right? Theory means we believe this is true, but we can't prove that it's true, right? But it's probably accurate because we see it played out over and over and over in people. So thinking about, right, even those relationships that you wrote down, right, for yourself when we first started, can you maybe see how or identify your own attachment style and then see how maybe it plays out in those relationships? Yeah. So I think that it is important, right, for us to consider that our past and the experiences, right, that we've had in the past matter. I don't know exactly how this might work because I know it's recorded, but I want to take time, right, to unpack this a little bit more. And so I want to ask for people to maybe share a little bit, but with the awareness, right, that we are recording. And so share what feels comfortable and safe for you. But I wanted to kind of check in, right? So not necessarily that you're talking about what your attachment style is. That might be very private, right, and intimate. But can you maybe talk about ways in which you see these things playing out in some of the relationships that you wrote down on your initial activity? Sure, yeah. And I thank you for sharing that, right? Because I think you bring up a key point in that we can have an attachment style. And the reason you feel anxious about like entering into these relationships could be because you have a secure attachment style, right? So it isn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily change with every relationship that we go into, but that we have a typical pattern and that pattern informs how we interact with people. So for you, right, like if something feels a little weird or maybe a little off, that anxiety is probably informative that it's not something, right, that aligns with what you want for yourself, or it's just a new scary experience that's not attached to your attachment style at all, for sure. So in kind of recognizing that your past experiences do influence how you show up in your current relationships and how you almost feel like those things were necessary, it sounds like, because of the place that you're in now, for sure. While somebody's being brave enough, I guess I'll I'll share because I think that's only fair if I'm asking that of you, right? So I don't know so much, even though I study this, right? I have probably could do more work on paying attention to what my attachment style is, but I think that's key to the piece that we'll talk about next, right? Is that sometimes the work that you have to do on yourself is hard when you're in it, right? But what I can say, and one of the things that I think our key is that I think for as far as relationships, I may be naturally just very cautious, right? And so in my friendships, in my romantic relationships, in my family, I always have a really big heart. And so in being one of those people that's very I don't know, mushy, right? Like that makes you vulnerable as well, right? And so I'm very cautious. And when I enter into relationships and the people that I allow right into my space. So I don't know that that relates necessarily to my attachment style, but I do think that I can see how it plays out and how it's maybe even like hindered me, right, in certain ways for sure. So anybody else want to share? When we look at like what we can do, so now we've learned like relationships are important, and we've learned that there are maybe specific um, kind of behind the scenes things, right, that can be playing out in how we connect with others and our relationship with ourselves and our past. Like, what do we do, right? So, how can we be intentional, right, about the way in which we come to be in relationship with ourselves and we come to heal the relationship that we have in our past? I think too, which is important, I think to highlight is that I'm speaking of it right from this place that like things may be negative, but these could also be very positive things, right? So it can also be right that I'm aware that there are ways in which I was privileged and very fortunate, right, in growing up. And that also plays into what I expect out of my relationships with other people. And so when we are going to kind of address these things, I think it's best to become curious, right? So how do we work on the relationship that we have with ourselves, with our past? Becoming curious. I think we can start right in a few very specific ways. So what can we do? I think prayer, right, as Christians is key. And a lot of times I'm working with people, I don't have the ability, right, to say that to them because they may not be believers. But I think there is something very special and fortunate, right, that we have as believers, and that's our relationship with God, right? So we can pray about very specific things. We can pray that God sends us, right, the relationships that will help us to improve our relationship with ourselves and our past. I often think about how the people closest to us act as mirrors, right? And so people talk about all the time, right? Your spouse is like a mirror, right? They show you all of the things that maybe you didn't see in yourself. And so asking God to send, right, intentional, healthy relationships in prayer is an important piece that I think a lot of us don't think about. I have a best friend, and she gets on my nerves the most, right? Because she's close enough, right, that she challenges me. She's always like, man, my friend always trying to break up with me. And I'm like, because it's uncomfortable for me, right? But me seeing how quickly I'm like, oh, it don't feel right, right? Is a thing. But she also will do things like, wow, look at this. The world doesn't revolve around you. And I'm like, friend, calm down, okay? So because we have the nature of the relationship that we do, right, I can receive that. Whereas if I don't maybe have those people that are closest to me, then I might not be receptive of somebody telling me those types of things. So praying about God sending you intentional, healthy relationships. I think another thing that we can pray about is having a keen sense of discernment, right? So maybe we're already in relationship with others and we need to figure out who it is, right, that can be those healthy, safe people, and maybe people who don't need to be there. And also praying, right, that we can see ourselves as genuinely as possible and, right, genuinely reflect on our past. Another piece that I think we have the power to do is to reflect. So, as transparent as I can be, right? And my own therapist will be like, Nikita, journal. And I'd be like, yeah, we gonna sure, that's great. And then whenever I do, I'm like, wow, this is great. Like I have these, what do I call them? Spontaneous revelations, like epiphanies, girl. Like this is why she's telling you, right, to do this, because there's something about turning inward, right? And sometimes it's not deep at all. Sometimes I'll be writing like random things, and then by the time that I'm done, it's like, wow, right? Some deeper understanding that I've come to. But it also doesn't have to be daily, right? You can also journal when you feel like there's something in your heart. I'll share that recently I did that, right? Not a consistent journaler, but I reflected and I said some things that I needed to have validated for myself, right? And that brought about healing that I got, and there was nobody else involved but myself. And then the second thing is to reflect by doing check-ins with yourself. So each time that I go through something significant, or there's some type of significant change or loss in my own life, I check in with myself about some very specific things. You can write these down if you want to, but I always say, what happened, right? Because we have a tendency to forget, right? We have a tendency, even whenever we see God bring us through something, to be like, oh yeah, I forgot, right? Like we can look back when we intentionally think about it, but the gravity or the depth of how bad it was, right, when we were in it, or how significant it was, isn't the same. So I try to be as specific as possible to say what was happening in this time. I also ask myself, what did I learn about how God works? And what did I learn about how the world works? So that's kind of like a combined, right, second question. And then I ask, what was I feeling? What was I thinking? And what was I doing? Right. So again, we know that like thoughts kind of beget how we feel, and then that begets what we do. So in this time where this significant thing was happening, what do I remember saying to myself? What thoughts were going through my mind? What do I remember feeling about the situation? And then what did I do? How did I respond? Right. And then lastly, I reflect, if I find myself in this situation or a similar situation again, right? What do I wish I would have done differently? What could I have done that would have been more helpful, right, to me and the outcome in this situation? And so those are check-ins that happen whenever I feel like something is big enough. And so that can be moving, right, away from your entire support system and starting something very difficult, or could be learning that, you receive some type of bad news. Anything that has the potential to change the trajectory of our lives. I think those are the things, right, that I think are important to do that check-in. What happened? What did I learn about God? What did I learn about the world? What was going on with me and my thoughts, feelings, behaviors? And what would I have done differently, right, if I could do it again? And then lastly, I think we can lean on our relationships, right? So again, when we're in it, if you think about a storm, it's very difficult to see objectively what's going on. So having safe relationships that can provide us feedback, right, about what's going on and maybe what happened is key. I remember going through my master's program, I had to do this assignment, and I was like, what just happened? What just happened, right? I gained so much insight from having tough conversations with people that are in my life, right? That were significant relationships to me. And so then lastly, I also think therapy, right, is an option. And so that is something that I think more people are coming around to, but something that can also be hard to access. And I can acknowledge that as well, right? But those are the things that I think are in our toolbox, right? That are very simple ways that we can start to address and ways we can do better, right? In our relationship with ourselves and our past. Why do I think this is important? Whenever I sit with couples, whether they're married or approaching marriage, 9 times out of 10, they've never had the opportunity to really reflect on whether or not they were a good fit, right? So I think what's interesting, right, is that so how do we like improve relationships? How do we improve marriages? How do we improve families? We know ourselves. We know ourselves and we know ourselves well, right? That we come as best we can, right? We never arrive, but we come as best we can into the relationships, being as healthy and as whole, and really submitted to God as we possibly can. So many times I'm like, I told y'all from the beginning that this was a bad idea, right? And I don't say that to them that way, of course, right? But like, it's often the case that people have no idea how they see relationships or believe about relationships. And so they come together trying to do life with another person who also doesn't know, who's influenced, right, by all of the pressures of the world. And it's just a big mess, right? So I think my heart lies with romantic relationships, marriages, families, how we can make them better. And I think the foundation of that is becoming more healthy within ourselves to take care and start right as a whole person, not a person who's seeking to be made whole, right, by a relationship, but a whole person of themselves. And so from what I understand, I'm not 100% sure as we go into the next month, I think we'll have an opportunity, right, to talk about more specific things in relationships. And I think that's kind of what I'm going to leave you with. There's a second part to our activity, but I want you to be thinking about like what things you can do, right, to do the work and the healing that you need and want to do for yourself in these relationships, right, with yourself and with your past, because then we can more fully engage in the relationships that we have with others. And so the extent to which and whether or not people expect to receive all their support and love from their romantic partner varies from person to person. Some people are like, oh yeah, I do, I love him, but I also got my mama and I also got my friends and all. And some people, right, really expect that the biggest chunk, right, I guess, of that love and support to come from the partner. And either way is wrong, right? But it's important to know yourself, to know what you need so that you can navigate that, right, if you come into a relationship with a different person. And so in that, I want us to kind of take a revisit, right, back to our activity. So I want you to refer to your list from when we first started talking, and I want you to take a minute to reflect on the ways in which your relationship with yourself and past show up in those relationships. And remember, that can be positive. So this is a little different from what we talked about, right, out loud. This is not necessarily about attachment styles, right? But how I think about myself, right? How does that reflect in the relationships that I highlighted or circled? And then I want you to consider one small thing you could do to be intentional about doing something different, right? So showing up a little bit differently for yourself and as it relates to your past. And then we'll come back together and talk a little bit. Okay, so again, going off of those that I can see, I'm going to start talking again for the sake of minding my time. But if you're still reflecting, definitely keep doing that. So I think that the take home in this is that all of us need support and love, right, from people in our lives, and that there are different things that happen in our past that may or may not cause us to engage in relationships in ways that either serve us or don't serve us. And so the best way, right, that we can show up for ourselves, right, and the people that maybe made that list, right, that we highlighted, is to like check in with ourselves. I think especially as women, we typically carry the bulk of the load of remote emotional, right? Heavy lifting, right, in our relationships. So we often are the caretakers, right? We often are that person who has to be worried about everybody else. It almost sometimes seems like selfish or bad, right? To think about turning towards and considering what you need. I challenge you to think of it as like an investment, right? Like if I am pouring into myself and taking care of myself and loving myself and seeing about myself, right, I'm better capable to serve these people, right, that I care about and that I love. And so even when it feels like an extreme sacrifice, even at that time that you take to reflect or to try to heal or to try to talk or get support where you need it, is like 5 minutes out of a day in a busy week. That I think is worth it, right? We don't despise small beginnings, right? Every little bit, right, that we can do to take care of ourselves and love ourselves, right, is going to multiply, right? It's going to be incredibly important in how we show up and we love the other people. In the list that I had you write about the people that you are, the relationships in which, right, are maybe most salient for you. and this can be maybe by a show of hands, I said, some of them may be ones that are requiring the most of you. For how many people is that true about the ones you wrote down? They're just needing a little extra energy right now. Yeah. And then how many people are in the case where these are the ones that you're most grateful for right now? Like, these are the ones you really, really appreciate. Yeah. I'm in that place too. I don't know if I shared this, but I'm not supposed to start crying about presentation. But I am doing like a very difficult thing right now. And I am so, so grateful for my mama. She like is everything, right? And so she would definitely be on my list had I done the activity myself, right? Because I'm just so incredibly grateful for her. And then the other piece was like maybe the relationships that are most concerning for us right now. How many of you, those are the ones that made the list for you? Okay, good. That's not very many people. You say you can't hear me? Is that what you said? Okay. Yeah. So I want you to just take time to consider that the love, the care, the attention that you give to other people every day, you deserve that too, right? And that in doing that, you will be able to better show up for the people and in the relationships, right, that are in your life. And so in that, right, seriously take time to consider what the next step is, right, that you can take and what you would like to do. I have some resources here that are kind of like global resources because I know people are all over the country. And so there are a couple of places that have like kind of these national registries where you can find free or lower price therapy. Most of us are here are are African American. So the ones that I included are freeblecktherapy.org and Therapy for Black Girls. But I also want to point out that local colleges and universities can also be a great way to receive free and reduced therapy services. So for example, I'm in a doc program. And so people who come to me in private practice, they pay probably like 3 times as much, right, as they pay when they see me through the clinic. So sometimes when people call me, I say, hey, go through the clinic, right? Because they cannot, afford to come through private practice. So being savvy, right, about the way those things go. So it doesn't mean that you're getting less qualified service necessarily, right? But those are good ways to try to get a hold of some resources that can like help us work on some of these things, can help us deal with the things of our past and deal with, having better relationships and thoughts about ourselves. And we can kind of go from there. I feel like I did good on time, but I think that's all I have. I do want to open up.
We are running out of time. Nikita, this has been a great topic. We really thank you very much for it. Everybody show us some love, give us some hearts, give us some hand claps. She said while she was doing her presentation about in July, we will continue the conversation. She just started the conversation tonight, but she is going to have a session, a focus group that's going to be talking about relationships in that poll that Pastor Hardy had us start last week, and we're going to do it again tonight. You can select those different things that you're interested in. If you want to be a part of the ongoing subject about relationships, you can join Nikita's group, and then it can be a little bit more focused on those things she'll have you for. I want to say at least 2 to 3 weeks Nikita would be there, and then it's probably another week that probably Dr. Streeter would do it also, because Nikita is not going to be available the week of her birthday. But so really it's going to be a great time. We're going to have other topics too, but if you really still need some answers about this relationship piece, then you can join that focus group and really have a deeper dive discussion about it. But I think she did a great job. All the information was really great and informative, right on time. I mean, I can speak on everything that everybody said, but we would be here a lot longer. But CC, I know exactly what you're talking about, and we can talk on the phone later on anytime, because I think we all experienced that when we got those different roles as a spouse and mother and daughter and all these different things or whatever, and then you add all the other things that are outside of our family or whatever, then we're expected to do a lot, wear a lot of hats, and not forget anybody. So I just really enjoyed this. The thing about it here at Intimate Moments Ministry, and Nikita kind of talked about it. Remember, she said God, self, and past. She left the God thing alone because we've been, focusing on that on Intimate Moments Ministry. But I love it. Really, I'm gonna say this and then I'm gonna stop. Truly, you two stop laughing at me. One of my friends told me about a week ago. She said one of the things that she heard a pastor say to her is that she had to see God as her father in order to have a real, true, intimate relationship with him. She came back and said, that's going to be difficult because I don't know what a father looks like. And so this is what Nikita is pointing out to us when it comes to ourselves and understanding these relationships. If people have had a hard time or didn't have a stable relationship with their dad, then they do have a hard time connecting with Father God because they don't have any reference to it. So until we actually identify who we are, knowing ourselves, knowing what affected us in the past, what things are, holding us back, what things are causing us really not to love ourselves and be able to really connect with people, the avoidance and all of that we have is all based on how we were raised, how we were brought up, and the relationships that we had in that, in our lives when we were coming up. And so that's key to what we're doing now. This relationship piece is going to help you to identify who you are and how to connect better with God and with people. So we're really excited about what we're going to be doing with this. So thank you again, Nikita. And Pastor Hardy, I turn it over to you.